Yeah, I would say if we didn't grow up in the orchard environment, and had I not known about mindfulness and meditation, I don't know what my life would have been like for me personally.
Mm.
I honestly don't know, because my dad's situation was very scary.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations, where we truly believe when you communicate better, you live better. So I'm one of your hosts, Chris. I'm glad to be with you again. And as always, I'm here with Lucie. Lucie, how are you today?
I'm good, Chris. Thank you. I just made some tea to sip while we are talking here. How are you doing?
Yeah, my 3-year-old, uh, he got up at 3:30 in the morning,
Uh-oh.
and I already go to the gym at 5. I already get up at 4:30. So I was like, I guess I'm not going back to sleep. So I've been up since
Oh
3:30. I should have
no.
should have taken a nap. I should have got an extra cup of coffee, but I
One
just
of those
didn't.
days.
One of those days. Luckily, I like talking to you, and it always jazzes me up. And I like talking to our guests about communication and their life story. So today, I'm excited to talk about with our guests. You know, if you listen to this podcast, a lot of our episodes this season have a theme that we didn't plan on, but a lot of it has been about men's issues, men's mental health, men's issues, men's relationships. We didn't plan it that way, but I strongly believe in it because men just, we don't have enough discussion about how we're functioning and how we get enough support in the world, because there's just a lot of stereotypes about how we're supposed to be. So
Mm.
I'm excited to talk about to our guest today, who's an expert in this stuff and doing this stuff and working with male leaders. So Purdeep, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, Lucy, Chris, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. Like when we connected, when we chatted before, I was really excited about the work you're doing and the stuff you're doing. So, but I don't want to speak for you. Do you want to share, how you got to where you are, your history with our listeners?
And sure, so I'll try not to make it so long-winded, but I think some context will help listeners figure out why I'm here right now. But basically, I grew up in Kelowna, British Columbia. It's a small town. And especially when I grew up there, it was a real cool place to grow up. It's basically like Napa Valley of Canada. There's vineyards, there's wineries, there's a lake, there's a ski hill. Actually, quite a few ski hills
Hmm,
within a couple hour
Nice.
driving distance. Some of the best in Canada. And I can tell you, I didn't really realize and know how good we had it until I moved away from there, because now I'm on the other side of the country and it's flat here in Ontario. So we don't have the same amount of mountains that we do as in BC. But I grew up there. My parents were immigrants. They came over in the 70s. I was born in Kelowna along with my brother. My parents came over with virtually no education and started to work, and eventually they bought their own business. And then I grew up in family business, and I had a really interesting upbringing, you could say, because there's so many different parts to my upbringing that enabled me to have the skills in terms of communication, but also to work with men in particular. Part of that was my dad's struggles, where because he had so much responsibility, but also because of how he grew up, he struggled with alcoholism. So he didn't have any challenges with money. But when he came over from India, he had so much responsibility to raise a family here. He was getting paid minimum wage, making next to nothing, working 14, 16 hours a day, and then also sending money back to his family, his parents in India
hmm,
and siblings to support them, because that was the expectation. And I think that
hmm,
was his outlet. Him and I never really talked about his challenges when it came to alcohol. I did voice my opinions of it because when he drank, he was a big guy too. He was 6'1", 240 pounds, strong guy, like old school masculine type of man. But he was also the most emotional man I knew. He was the one that taught me that you can be a man and still cry, and you can share your feelings. So he was very open that way. His only challenge, his major challenge, was the alcoholism, because when he drank too much, he became a completely different person. This is where we talk about the difference between the masculine and the feminine, because he would shift into a completely different energetic state. His communication, if we're talking about communication, would change and it wouldn't be very effective. A lot of times there would be anger in it, a lot of sadness, a lot of stuff I think that he tried to bury from whatever his childhood was like. And so that was a part of my upbringing, and that's important because as a young kid, as a young boy, I was always trying to figure out my dad in terms of what made him tick, particularly what
hmm,
would make him drink. So a lot of times I would watch his behavior, his mannerisms, and I would be able to identify if he was going to drink that evening or not, just based on his routines and his habits. And even if he dressed a certain way, I would be able to figure it out. And so that gave me a specific skill, which I've carried for the rest of my life. I also had a grandfather, so my dad's dad and my dad's mom came over. So my grandparents came over from India. But my grandfather taught me spirituality. He taught me mindfulness and meditation as a young boy because his father, my great grandfather, was a spiritual teacher in India for 60 plus years. So I
Nice.
learned and I grew up with these concepts of meditation and mindfulness and being able to do things that our mind enables us to do when we truly tap into it and use it uh, to make it work for us rather than against us. So it was really interesting because I learned techniques such as meditation, as I said before, but also lucid dreaming and all these other things that were really cool as a young kid because I had a photographic memory. I had straight A's throughout school. I was able to do things that other kids were just kind of like, oh, how did you do that? And that's because of just being able to tap into these practices that enabled me to do these things. So that was one other aspect of my life. I became a personal trainer at 17. And I realized at that time, because I have a passion for helping people, it was just part of my DNA. And I realized at that time that I could help someone. I could put a plan together for someone who wanted to get fitter or gain more muscle, whatever that looked like, just feel better about themselves. But most of the time, 80% of the time, they wouldn't do it on their own. And I was really scratching my head because I was like, okay, what is going on here with people? They say they want to do this, but they're not putting in the time or the effort or the discipline. And I grew up that way because my grandfather not only was a spiritual man, but he was in the military for 30 plus years in India. So I
Wow.
grew up with a discipline, and it was really interesting because, not that he was like military, but he was a very disciplined man. And so I grew up with that. So I was like, why isn't everybody else kind of disciplined with what they do? But they're not. But there's so many other things that had to go on in terms of their psyche, the support system at home, the communication that they would have within themselves. And that's when I started to study performance psychology. Prior to that, though, and this is kind of, it's everything in my life that it came together because when I was in grade 6 or 7 too, I had a substitute teacher that came over from Europe. And at that time, they were actually a little bit more advanced when it came to things like positive psychology and certain things like that. And I remember the teacher drawing on the chalkboard. He had drawn a number of words and put circles around them, connected them with lines, and said, "This is the mind map." And that is the first time I ever saw a mind map in my life. And that was up until probably even 20 years later. I was bringing mind maps into schools. I was bringing mind maps into work organizations because they hadn't heard about it. But at that time, when I asked my teacher, I said, "What is this?" He basically said to me, he said, "If you're really interested, go look up inventors or scientists like Leonardo da Vinci and Einstein and so forth." And that time was public library. So I went there and got some books. And I realized that they all had very similar approaches. And two of them were drawing and connecting ideas, similar to like a mind map.
Yeah.
And the other one was this belief of a universal consciousness or genius of knowledge. So it's not that they were coming up with these ideas; they were just able to tap into them. So I use those, and so from there I started to study neuroscience. At that time, it was called brain science. So I started to study brain science 30 years plus years ago, performance psychology. Fast forward, and with my uh, experience with my dad and studying relationships, because I was also fascinated with my dad's behavior, but also his interactions with my mom. Because I was a young boy and I would see my mom feeling sad, angry, them getting into fights when my dad would drink. And I was there as kind of like her protector as well. So that was part of my upbringing. But also growing up in a traditional Indian household, which I would say was a great thing because gender roles outside, let's just take my dad's alcoholism out of the way. We functioned great as a family. We knew what the role was, each of us. We worked together. We were a team. And my parents had different roles based on their gender. My mom did more of the inside stuff. My dad did more of the outside stuff. My mom still worked too. Like she worked physically hard on our orchard as well, because that's how I grew up. I grew up on an orchard and we
Oh,
grew
wow.
apples and cherries. Yeah. So it was a very mindful environment. I would say that's the other aspect because I grew up in nature. Sometimes for the entire day, I wouldn't be interacting with another human being. It would just be me and nature and the trees. So
Hmm.
this This concept of, for example, in the Japanese culture, they talk about cherry blooms and how beautiful that is. That moment when a cherry bloom comes out, I've saw it every single year for decades because you look at an orchard where it's completely white or red or pink cherry blooms, blossoms, you can say. It was just an amazing sight. And just to watch the trees grow, I know some people say, like, what do you mean? I would literally go out there and watch the trees grow every single day. I'd look and say, oh, look, that branch got that much longer. It was almost like having thousands of kids
Hmm.
with all these trees. But it was a really interesting way to grow up and being in tune with myself and my mind and mindfulness. But then throughout my years, I've always been a mentor, teacher, trainer. I excelled in all my careers. And then I left and started my own advisory firm, which was two particular areas of focus. One is helping people grow and scale their business and be successful in business. The other one was in the personal side because I realized I didn't want to be on the personal side, in all honesty. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to fall into the category of, life coaching or Tony Robbins or anything like that.
Sure,
It was
sure,
more
sure, sure.
business. But what I realized was 80% of the work that we were doing was on the personal side, the personal effectiveness, all the strategies that I had implemented. So I have a very, like, because I grew up in science, very systematic approach, very experimental approach. So I built systems around how to operate as a human being. And then I actually built an organization, and this is the exciting part, where we worked with 20 different universities and research institutions around the science of high performance in the business world. And we were trying to solve this problem, which was how can a business professional perform at their highest potential, but also live, I should say, and live a high quality of life at the same time? Because
Hmm.
I always go back to my dad. I always go back to say, what if he had someone that could have given him guidance, or my parents? What would
Hmm.
their lives have been like, both on a business side, but also on a personal side? So since then, I've also done a lot of work with men's leadership roles, and how men interact not only as business leaders but also as husbands and fathers. And that's been a big part of my calling. I also wrote the book The Complete Man because a lot of men are lost these days, and we can talk about that, uh, more in this episode. But fast, where I am today, that's what we do. We have a number of different companies that help people either grow or scale their business, both large and small corporations. And then we also have a high performance and personal effectiveness and leadership company that focus on helping people really be successful in their personal lives in combination with their professional life.
Hmm.
So I'll pause there because I did a lot of talking.
A couple of thoughts come to mind is number one, your microphone sounds incredible. So great quality. Number two, I think what's interesting is we all have that experience, the three of us necessarily. Our lives are personally touched by immigration. Lucie's an immigrant herself, but you and I are both children of immigrants.
Mhm.
And I think there's such an interesting mindset of somebody who's an immigrant or the next generation after an immigrant that still stands there. How does, yeah, in your mind, when you're approaching all of your situations, like viewing, whether you talk about that alcoholism or not, how do you kind of, how do you think that's influenced how you think about communication, or what is relationships? What is effectiveness? Like, how do you think that's impacted that?
Well, I think there's definitely a big cultural aspect because Eastern culture is different in terms of
Yeah.
communication than the Western culture, right? We're talking about more communal in Eastern and more independent here in the Western side. And for example, in the Indian culture, we have this. Uh, it's very much about respecting elders. So even when I
Hmm.
speak to someone, an elder, that I'm teaching them in certain aspects, there's a certain level of respect that I have to have. I think that's something that we've lost today for sure in the Western world in terms of that respect because we've lost that wisdom. But I always go back to, if you're talking about immigration and parents, and I go back to the struggles that they had and the reason why
Hmm.
they came here and the reason why they worked so hard. And what am I doing to live out their sacrifice, their struggles? And so my communication really revolves around the impact that I have because I have my parents did everything for us, my brother and I. So what am I
Yeah.
giving back? And so I look at the cultural aspects of communication because again, it is different. It's more respectful from that perspective. And then obviously trying to tie it into the Western world. So I think
Mm.
And so I still find myself, I communicate differently with my mom than I do with anybody else. Because
Mhm.
we obviously she's my mom, but also a traditional Indian woman. She's modernized, like she was 18 when she came here, so she kind of grew up in the culture,
Mhm.
but still has a traditional background. And I'm trying to teach that to my kids too, because my kids have this. We talk about respect all the time, but it's different for them, and I've seen that. So you're
Yeah.
trying to instill that within them. So that's what I see. I think the biggest thing when it comes to communication is the level of respect and how that's
Mm.
different.
And the other thing I saw was, you mentioned like you when you were getting used or not used, but just after growing up with your dad's alcoholism, you were starting to notice like signs and triggers. And I don't know if I told you this earlier, but I'm a licensed therapist as well, and I've worked with trauma, heavily. And there's that idea of hypervigilance, like it's very common. You just kids of parents like that, they just get used to seeing all these signs. And my mom had PTSD because she was a refugee from the Vietnam War. And so she had like, we didn't know it at the time growing up, obviously. We just like thought that was just who she was.
Wow.
But like I learned that hypervigilance also, just like you, like we're noticing these signs that we pick up on. And I find that it's really helpful for me when I'm working with clients. Like I'm much more present. I can perceive like when they're feeling some sort of way about something. How do you, but I think it's interesting that you also grew up with mindfulness and that those skills of kind of calming yourself. Did you ever see any kind of conflict or just kind of discrepancy between the part of you that wanted to be hyper vigilant and be aware of what was going on and always thinking, and then the part of you that was calming and relaxing?
Yeah, I would say if we didn't grow up in the orchard environment, and had I not known about mindfulness and meditation, I don't know what my life would have been like for me personally.
Mm,
I honestly don't know, because my dad's situation was very scary because he was a big guy and something in his life didn't go right. His dad, so my grandfather was in the military, as I said, was
yeah.
living outside. He was away from home for 10 months out of the year. So he only got to see my dad 2 months out of the year. And a lot of the times as a military dad, my dad was a little bit afraid of his own dad.
Mm,
So
hmm.
they didn't have that relationship that I think could have been as healthy as it should have been. And also, I think, well, I know this because my grandfather also, not for any, I don't know what the reasons were, but my dad went as a young boy, with my grandfather to military posts at times and stayed there for a certain amount of time. And I don't think that was the best place for a kid, because it's not like military posts here. We're talking about India 60 plus years
Mm,
ago. And
yeah.
a lot of these times, they conditions were horrible. So I think my dad probably saw things that challenged him. But the reason, coming back to this hypervigilance piece, is I was scared because whatever happened to my dad, he would wake up if he drank too much, and he would have night terrors. And if he woke up in the middle of the night and
Yeah.
those night terrors, it was like a bomb went off in the house, like
Mm,
yelling. Anybody in his way was just like, watch out. He would never hurt my brother and I. I knew that for a fact, but still, as a young boy, you get freaked out because if someone else was in his way, and he
sure.
was a big guy, he would make sure they're not in his way. So that
Mm,
definitely, that hypervigilance, when you use that term, that's what it was. I like to say it's more awareness and alertness now, right?
sure.
Because it's empowering now. At that time, it was very scary, and it's a protection mechanism, obviously.
Yeah.
And so the the techniques that I used was literally spending time with myself in the orchard, meditation, mindfulness, and also lucid dreaming, because that's something else
Mm,
that
cool.
I learned how to do just through the practices, and which was, I think, very empowering for me. But I can also tell you there was times like I used to do walking meditation a lot inside the house, and I had done it. So I would do that for like 2 hours when my parents, like between school and when my parents get home, 2, 3 hours. That I remember going back to that house years later. We still owned
Mm,
it. We had renters, and we had the same carpet. I'd literally worn a track in the carpet
Wow.
because
mm,
I did it so often. I think part of that was obviously getting into that meditative state and doing it so often, but I think also part of that was a coping mechanism. I
mm.
think I did it to just kind of escape as well and be able to tune in or tune out into something different.
I really want to acknowledge here that I appreciate your perspective of as you are sharing about the childhood, your history. It seems like you really look at, there were some difficult things in my life, in my childhood, and you're also seeing how that actually supported you in becoming the person that you are today, and giving you the gifts of self-awareness, of really being able to be sensitive to the environment, to other people, to be connected with the nature, and looking at that as really something. Any difficult situation in our life can be something, a blessing in a way, in disguise, and you're using that to support now others that are struggling. That being said, what would you say are the main, let's say, three struggles that you see people have in that personal effectiveness world, let's say?
I would say the number one struggle that I see people have right now is, or just in general, is relationships, and
Mm.
primarily their intimate relationship. I can tell you for men in particular, and we work with a lot of women too, 8 out of 10 men are struggling in their relationship. And that is
Mhm.
causing them a lot of pain and anguish. And this is the same applies to women too, I think, is because they want to connect. They want to be with that person, whether it's a communication error or a challenge or something else. There is some kind of barrier there in the relationship where they are lacking that satisfaction and fulfillment. That's one thing I see very, very common amongst the vast majority of people. And we've worked and done studies with a lot of people. The other one right now that we are seeing in the personal effectiveness space or just in general is a collective low level of energy.
Mm.
We are seeing that in a significant amount, and especially in the workforce as well. People's relationship levels. So there's you can measure this because communication is two things. It's a form of transfer of energy and information. That's what communication is effectively, right? It's a transfer of, hey, it's an influence. This is the information I'm sharing, but it's also an energy share as well. So, and why people say, what do you mean it's an energy share? Well, every form of communication with words or body language or whatever that is comes into one of our senses, one of our five senses. You're not necessarily licking people, so that's not one of the senses that comes in, but it gets
Hopefully not.
yeah, well, maybe if you're a kid. My son, he's 11. He still does that every once in a while to annoy me.
Oh
So
boy.
yeah, so I would say that still applies for him. That's still applicable. So that those senses, we take that information and convert it into energy. So it is absolutely energy. There are electrons that come into our brain that we use to figure things out. So that's what communication is. And coming back to this low level of energy, this is what we're seeing is people through COVID have come out very obviously socially isolated because one of the other core aspects, you would know this as Chris, and sorry, Lucie, I don't know your background, but we are social beings and our brain to be healthy and remain healthy needs to remain social. In fact, it's one of the key things that can help us not necessarily improve our IQ, but keep our intelligence or slow us down from aging is social interactions. So this has dropped in terms of energy. People at the workforce are not as engaged anymore. They are not driven anymore. And this is a general blanket statement. This is not
Mhm.
everybody, but
Yeah.
we are seeing a high level. In 2023, we did a survey, research survey in Canada with a large population size, and we identified that 83% acknowledged or said that they were either burnt out or have been burnt out in the last 12 months.
Mm.
So what is this doing to the workforce from a productivity perspective? It's like at an all-time low. And what does that also do from relationships and communication? Well, guess what? When you're low energy, you don't communicate very effectively.
Mhm.
And that's the biggest challenge that we're seeing within relationships right now, too. So we have relationship challenges, we have low level of energy in terms of productivity, motivation, and drive. And then we're seeing the impact of a lack of effective communication. Again, not only have an impact on relationships, but personal well being as well. And stress, burnout, depression, anxiety. We've seen those numbers go up. And it's not just COVID, it's because of technology as well. Firm believer, we've been watching this for the last 10 years. We haven't done direct studies on it, but our partners have, that our now digital era is one of the causes of poor communication amongst individuals and within relationships.
So I'm hearing two big challenges with the relationships: how to connect, how to have the effective communication, and also the low level of energy. What would you say? What can we do with that? How
Oh,
to increase? What would be some of the tips?
yeah,
No, it's a.
that's an interesting one. It's so first of all, it's very personal to the individual. But
Mhm.
we do this as part of our training. This is part of advisory. In fact, my wife is a functional medicine expert that
Mm.
has an expertise in health performance. So this is what we do when we work with our clients because she works on the health side and I work on the cognitive and emotional side and spiritual side. So we
Nice.
kind of try to hit all four areas because energy comes into one of four categories: your cognitive, emotional, physical, and spiritual. So then we have to identify what is challenging those, and all four of those buckets influence each other. And the core of that is what we call source, which is your spiritual, right? If the spiritual is low, all the other ones are going to be low and they're not going to be sustainable. So
Mm.
we also have to take a look at the spiritual side. Some people are open to it, some people are not. Not that we do any voodoo magic or anything like that, but according to that person's beliefs and backgrounds and knowledge, we help them and guide them. Perhaps you may want to try meditation. Perhaps you may want to get more in touch with your faith or whatever that, or purpose, or whatever that looks like for that individual, because that will help with the source energy.
Mm.
Then there's a whole methodology that we have when it comes to that. But there's the physical part. Are you eating healthy? Are you taking the
Mm.
proper supplements? And are you getting enough rest and sleep? Then there's the cognitive emotional. Where does stress fit in? Where does anxiety fit in? Are you doing fun stuff? Are you doing stuff that energizes you, activities? Are there people
Mm.
in your life
Mm.
that are drawing energy away from you? So we have a checklist. It's a very systematic, and we go through and we, depending on where that person is low, we identify what they need to do to bring their energy levels up. And that is, if we can help a person bring their energy levels up, then we can also help them in other areas because when energy is low, they're also challenged with decision making. They're also challenged with performance in those different areas of their life. If energy is low too, guess
Mm.
what? Their body energy, their immune system is going to be lower too.
Mm.
So there's a cyclical
Yeah.
effect here. There's an ecosystem here when it comes to the energy level. So it's a big animal, but we try to break it down little by little.
Can I go back to the isolation stuff? I totally agree with you. I think it's especially like we all love remote work, especially because commuting is terrible for everybody. And there is an element of community and human interaction that is missed out on a big daily basis. I was talking to an accountant friend of mine, and in the accounting world, a lot of teaching and mentoring of young folks is through like those quick 20-second interactions, like, hey, how do you do this? But you can't do that remote. Like you have to be intentionally calling somebody and you're interrupting them in another meeting. And so I think, yes, not every role needs to have that level of collaboration all the time, but you're still missing out on human interaction on an ongoing basis. And so, how do you, I guess, just thinking large scale, how are you kind of balancing the need for um, human interaction, collaboration, socialization to build that, but also the reality of remote work is also just logistically easier for a lot of
Yeah.
people.
I'll talk about my personal experience and I'll talk about it from our organizational experience.
Yeah.
So my personal experience, I built my business in the US originally. And then I made a conscious effort because I was traveling down there quite a bit because I had two young kids to do more remote and virtual because I wanted to be around with my kids. So
Mm-hmm.
before my wife said I was in lockdown before lockdown even happened
Mm.
because I was doing, we were doing Zoom calls and everything beforehand. And it was great because I could spend time with my kids. And during this life stage, I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. I've made that conscious choice. Right now, I'm in my home office. This is where I work 90% of the time. And it's great, but it can also be lonely. But I spend my time interacting with my kids. That's
Mm.
that's for me because it's important. I know they need that. They need their dad around. We get to bond. But there are days where I'm lonely. There are days where I'm just like, okay, I need to go out and hang out. Maybe I'll just go out with friends for dinner, or maybe we'll just go to a bar, have a couple of drinks, we'll go visit
Mm-hmm.
family, whatever that looks like. Absolutely. From a business perspective, I can tell you so many people, it's really interesting what's happened in Canada in particular around this topic because we just recently had a the public uh, so the public sector, so the government, their union basically because the government wanted the workers to come back and work 3 days physically in the office. The union was complaining. They're like, no, we want to do 2 days. All our workers are functional. Everything is being done in 2 days. That's a bunch of BS. I can tell you
Mm.
right now, that's a bunch of BS because working from home, again, is individual. Some people are more productive from home. Some
Yep.
people are not.
True.
I would say, if I was to guess, I would say the vast majority are not because the vast majority have not built in the systems, the discipline, and the mental approach to separate work from business. And then what ends up happening is they work longer hours, work into
Yeah.
evenings. They can't delineate, differentiate, and it's hurting them more than helping them. An employer like the union in this particular instance, not that I'm union bashing, but they have no clue what they're talking about because social isolation, yeah, there's a direct correlation between depression as well and anxiety. So if you're
Mm.
isolated, right, social support is so important for that. So that's why we're also seeing higher numbers of people within depression and anxiety, and workplaces are not understanding that. I firmly believe. And so the interesting part here is my background's in innovation leadership. That's what I did my MBA in. And a core part of innovation is bringing people together in the same room,
Mhm.
interacting physically with each other's presence. I'll debate all day long with those individuals that say no, virtual teams are just as innovative because it's a different level of
Mm.
energy. It's a different
Yeah.
level of communication because
Yeah.
you can when I was in the corporate world, my innovation teams, for example, we had private offices, but we also had communal offices where they can go and just huddle and interact with each other and walk over to each other's desks and ask questions. That is not happening anymore.
Yeah.
And how many people like we're seeing, even when you call some businesses right now and it's customer service line and you can tell they're answering from home. You can tell that their
Mhm.
phone quality is not that great. Half the time it's broken, whatever it is. What is that doing to the business results? It's not helping them. I appreciate everybody. I don't want to drive downtown. No, thank you. So I'm not saying that, people should be forced to work down the 5 days a week, but we need to understand what the ramifications are from a personal perspective, a health perspective, and a productivity perspective, because it's not necessarily more productivity. Now, the interesting thing here is, and this is my theory and our theory, and we haven't tested this. We will probably do studies on this, but I do believe in the business world, the number one competitive advantage, if we take technology and AI out of the picture, going forward for an organization that has people, is going to be the people's well-being and quality of life. Because if they don't have proper well-being, they're not going to be as productive. They're not going to be performing at the high level. They're not going to be able to sustain. They're going to be dropping like flies, which we saw, right? People were just
Mhm.
quiet quitting, right? They just
Yeah.
wanted to say. So it is of the best interest of the company to identify how do they help their people have better well-being. And that's not easy. It's not an EAP program,
Right.
right? Because that's very passive. This is where, we don't do wellness training. That's not our approach. But we do high performance training, which incorporates quality of life and well-being. So
Mm.
this is where we come in because we've told people that on a scale of burnout, you have burnout on one end, then you have proper well-being, then you have high performance on this side. You cannot get someone to be a long-time high performer if they don't have proper well-being. They will burn out.
Yeah.
And that's a bigger challenge. So that's where, and if we're talking about communication, we've seen the communication amongst teams, the quality drop because they're so digitized now. There's more MS Teams communications and pop-ups, and people are getting more frustrated. I can tell you,
Yeah.
vast majority of our clients that we work with, they are getting upset with all the pop-ups every time their team messages them and all these digital notifications because it's now frying. I'm going to use that word loosely, right? It's
Mhm.
frying their brain. It's frying their attention. It's distracting them.
Yeah. I took off all the notifications on my computer and my phone for those kind of things. And it did make a big difference when I took all those notifications off.
Yeah, it
And
makes a
that,
huge difference because they're billion-dollar companies. When I was in university in the US, I remember they were pigging off behavioral scientist grads straight out of Stanford for 200 grand. No experience.
hmm,
They're the social media companies because they
yeah,
wanted these scientists to help them. And we're talking about over a decade ago. They wanted these scientists to help them build their apps because if you can understand how the brain works, you can get people
right.
adopting your technology and hooked on your technology. It's as simple as that.
You said a really interesting thing about wellness is because I used to do trainings on like burnout and wellness, and I actually didn't like doing those because those were never very useful for employees because it didn't change the structure of kind of the things that were stressing them out in the first place. It was really just saying, hey, it's kind of saying it's your fault that you have too much work. You just need to figure it out how to handle it better. So what are you, I mean, I appreciate that you're thinking about like more organizationally, how are people and leaders creating that? What are you thinking about when you're trying to work with organizations in improving that wellness?
There's a number of different things. So from our perspective and our research, yes, there's uh, it's one, we have to teach the individual how to manage themselves. That's the most important aspect because if they can manage themselves, they're going to be able to say, okay, this environment is for me or if it's not for me, right? Because then if they say, this is the best I can do with the tools that you have given me and the knowledge that you have given me that I have applied properly, I'm still feeling overwhelmed and stressed and all this kind of stuff. Now they can actually make that decision to say this environment is for me or not. And from an organizational perspective, they have to truly understand how people work. I'll give you a simple example. There's this misconception that was out there in management based on some misinterpretations of studies that said, hey, if people are extrinsically motivated, meaning that they are strictly motivated by money or whatever that is, that's bad. People have more of an intrinsic motivation style. That's better because they're doing it because they want to do it internally. That's not the case. That's not what the study showed. Both are very
Mm,
important. Both are just as important. If you layer them together, you can actually make people more motivated. So we have to create an environment based on actual knowledge and what's actually working for people and individuals. But organizations do need to support proactively talking about this concept of well-being, which they're doing, but incorporating that into the culture and actually saying, in our culture now, what is happening when people are working there in office 3 days versus 4 days or whatever that looks like, and how do we change things? I think that whole aspect is I think there's going to be more weight put on that going forward. And then better leadership as well. And here's my take on this. A very poor leader can just destroy a culture, can destroy motivation, can destroy people's well-being as well. So we have to be more conscious and aware of that. But here's the bigger thing that I noticed, Chris, when you're talking about wellness training, when you're talking about these other things, the most important thing is integration and, well, implementation and integration. Because when we're talking to a group of, let's just say 30 individuals, right? Now we're asking them to go out and do things individually. And the chances are
mm,
very few of them are going to do that. What we have to say is now, what are we going to do as a group to integrate that into our company? That's what I see missing a lot within organizations
mm.
because that integration isn't happening. And it's much easier to change a person's behavior in a group setting when there's social support, but also social accountability than individually.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're kind of missing the mark there on that side. And on the flip side too, and I appreciate wellness training because it's very, very important. We also, this is what I acknowledged for myself, right? This was a turning point for me when we built our organization. No one trains us how to be higher performers and more productive. And this is very important for us because can the average person get 8 hours of work done in 4 hours? And the answer is yes. But no one trains us how to do this. This is what we train people on.
Mm,
So now, if we actually train them how to be higher producers and performance wise, now they have the ability to manage themselves more effectively. The vast majority of people, if you ask them, they're like, oh, I got so much on my desk. Like, I don't know where to start in terms of prioritization and all this. I don't have enough time. That's the number one factor people say or they attribute to their misery or whatever that is. The next is
mm,
energy. I don't have the time or energy, right?
mm.
And that comes into a capacity thing. So we have to show people how to have more capacity. The other thing too, sorry, I'm rambling about this, but I'm so passionate. But this is where when we talk about it from a work perspective, it's not just work, it's personal life. Because I can guarantee you, people are burnt out at work because of their relationships at home.
Mm. Yeah.
They're burnt out at work because they're not eating healthy or not taking the proper supplements. So we give them point improvements, but we don't talk about the entire system and ecosystem. And that's what we need to do a better job of. And EAP programs guess what? The percentage usage is typically 3 to 6%. If an organization hits 10%, they're doing really well. But the
Yeah.
vast majority of employees are not going to do that. And I think my belief system is that we need to, just like, my wife and I were talking about this the other day, where her friend, one of her best friends, they're Catholic, and they were forced to do, it's kind of like a pre-wedding counseling with a priest or whoever it might have been to make sure that they were aligned in values and so forth. I don't know if this person was a professional or whatever that is. I'm not judging the quality of it, but I like the concept because they were talking about the requirements of being married. They were talking about better skills to be married. So that was kind of like a pre-training, approach to that, which is awesome if we're getting into a relationship and marriage because no one teaches us how to have a good marriage. We learn from those around us. Same thing with productivity and performance. We are taught, and even wellness, let's just include that in there. So imagine a new employee is hired in an organization, and now we are teaching them the basic core skills. This is how you have proper wellness. This is how you have optimal performance and productivity and well-being. Now go ahead. We're going to teach you how to have better technical skills so you can actually apply those in your workplace. Because the people, they go straight into the technical training, which is great. I understand people's restrictions in terms of budgets, right? Because people just don't have the time. Sometimes they need to get people right in the workforce. But, learning is there's a system and methodology behind learning. And if a person isn't in proper well-being, they're not going to learn as effectively and they're going to go into the job maybe at 20% in terms of what they learned. But coming back to what I'm saying here, my rant is that if we included this basic life skills type of training for individuals in organizations before they went onto the job site or place into the roles, they would be a lot more effective because now it's been ingrained culturally into them. It's an expectation as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
That connects me to the topic that I am passionate about, which is emotional intelligence. If imagine if that were taught at schools as kids, how can we be self-aware? How can we have empathy for others? How can we regulate our own emotions and have the skills and tools? I would say that would equip us to realize, I don't feel so good today. What's going on? And to actually find the ways, how can we give ourselves more energy? And I'm hearing from your approach really, in a way, both self-leadership and and kind of organizational leadership and leadership of others. And looking how can we put that in place, the wellness, and then build on that, because the wellness sounds like it's part of the high performance. And also the relationships are part of the puzzle in a way, and the pieces of the picture of high performance. What would you say part of the relationships is the communication? What are usually, let's say, besides lack of energy, what other things get in the way of communication?
Okay, so one is fear. So fear of it. So communication, let's just say if you're shooting the SHIT, that's cool. You don't really have a fear factor, but it's very important that we communicate in tough times. When something is on my mind and I need to speak to my wife about it, yet if I have a fear that something is going to go sideways or she's not going to take it properly, I'm going to shy away from that communication. I may not communicate at all, or B, I'm just going to be, maybe not as direct or as effective in terms of my communication because there's always a fear factor there. And why do I use that example? Because that's how a lot of guys feel, if I'm talking about men in particular. So that fear is very, very important. I'm going to use a real life example because, Chris, you asked me to share real stories and stuff.
Yeah.
How many men we talk to that we work with that are afraid to have tough conversations with their wives because they're not happy, but they're afraid that if their wife doesn't like what they say, they're going to lose their kids or they're going to lose half their net worth or whatever that might be. So they just suck it up. So that's one aspect, I would say, from a communication standpoint. That's a challenge. The other one is, okay, no one's really taught us how to communicate effectively. Okay, that's a basic one, right? So how do you
Yeah.
actually communicate your feelings? How do you do it effectively? The other one I would say that's happening right now that I'm seeing affect more and more couples is technology. They're communicating via technology rather than in person. And that is uh, obviously you can't say what you want to say in an emoji. That's not going to work.
Mhm.
And so we're breaking it down into the bare basics that's getting misinterpreted. And I think that is a huge challenge right now within relationships or couples or whatever that may be, is a misinterpretation of information. And here's the other aspect here. If we're getting into the science and the psychology of this, because this is important.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be the first to put up my hand because my kids constantly bring it to my attention. And I've had to learn how to be better at this because of what's happened with our technology usage, and we're constantly distracted, is we are no longer focusing in as much in when we are communicating with other people. So what ends up happening is we miss information. If my attention, because I've been popping on my phone and my brain is still focused on the message or the email that I saw, and my son comes up to me and says something, because I have to catch myself, because I do this.
Mhm.
I have to catch myself and say, okay, no, eye contact. Or he will say, Dada, put your phone away. You're not looking at me. Okay, eye contact. I need to focus in on him so I can get the information, acknowledge that we are communicating here, that I truly care, and uh, I really want to communicate with him, right? Because that energy needs to be exchanged, that information needs to be exchanged properly. I've also caught myself many times missing out on key information because I wasn't present. So presence, particularly focus, attention, and presence, is a big challenge in today's communication. So that's my and I again, if I go back to this, I think this is going to be, if we take a look at a basic human skill that is going to be one of the most valuable, that is one of the most valuable, but will be even more valuable going forward. It's going to be like the platinum for people in relationships. It's going to be the platinum for workers at the workplace, and for leaders is going to be the skill of attention and focus and being present.
Mm.
Because most people are going the opposite way.
How do you, I guess, how do you get people to focus on just even wanting to do that? Or when people come to you, are they already wanting to change that? They're already recognizing there is a problem. Um, or I guess are you like helping them think through that like a bit necessary, the necessity of focusing on that attention and being aware?
Yeah, we have an entire, you know, training program on attention and focus. And so that's a big thing to change, but it's to change that a person has to change their behavior and habits, and that's not easy to do unless they are
Yeah.
absolutely driven to do it, as you know, right? And this is the toughest thing that I had to come across. And if that person is not motivated, does not have a strong desire to do things differently because of whether positive opportunity or negative repercussions, they're going to be stuck, and that's hard. I can tell, like I went to uh, I think it was 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, I was flying. I went to the checkout for the airline, and both ladies there that were working were on their phones while they were serving me.
Mm.
I was like, and they were showing each other like their Instagram posts and stuff. I was like, are you kidding me?
Oh no.
So this behavior piece has to change. It has to shift. And sometimes we have to make hard choices. Sometimes there's a hard line. In Ontario, the government, so our province, the government basically came out and banned cell phones in schools. They also now have put a lawsuit out to social media companies saying you've screwed up our teaching. I don't know if
Mm.
that's going to go anywhere, right? But at least they've made a hard stance on that. So the question then is, can we be disciplined enough? Because it is so hard. We are fighting against like, it's a tsunami that has hit us when it comes to technology. It is hard because all my kids, my son, when can I get a phone? When can I get a phone? So and so has a phone. You're not going to get one till you're 15 or 16 years old. Story, kid. Like it
Yeah.
takes hard. It's hard to be a parent these days because of these certain things. So discipline is very important. If people don't, and Chris, I'd love to get your take on this because we don't get into this realm of relationships or therapy or anything like that. But what I've seen is so many relationships break down because they haven't been able to communicate effectively, because they haven't been able to focus, whether it's anxiety, right? Because anxiety impacts focus and attention. We've seen anxiety levels go up significantly since COVID, which has a cascade effect onto relationships. But what is it? Sometimes people just have to feel or go through the process of losing and losing big time and the fear of losing before they changed. I don't know what your experience is.
Well, that's a multi-layered question. And we talk about this a lot actually on this podcast too. Like relationships are hard and people change. I think that's what makes it hard is
Mm.
we are constantly changing and evolving, hopefully evolving, but at least changing. And so the way we view the world is different, the way we have expectations about the world. And in personal relationships, the hard part is without good communication about where you're at, without realizing it, both partners actually change their expectations of each other over time. And if they never discussed it to begin with, and they're still not discussing it, you get kids, you get older, you have job changes, you're a different person from when you started the relationship. And so now you have all these different expectations of what you think the other person should be like or should be doing. And you're still also part of you is like holding on to like what it used to be like when you were like, when you were more carefree and you had fun. And so that erodes at you because you're assuming, Lucy has this great quote, assumptions are the termites of relationships. It's because you're assuming the other person should be doing something and then they're not doing it. And so they're not meeting your need. They're not meeting your expectations. So it just grinds at you. And some of those things are really can be minor, right? Like my wife hates seafood. She doesn't like seafood. It's annoying, like when we're trying to figure out food, but it's not going to like break our relationship. Right. But if there was something bigger that was more meaningful to me, then they would start gnawing at me more. And I may, like to your point, I may not say anything about it out of the fear of something or hurt something. Or um, another thing that affects men also is we may not feel like our emotions are valid because people tell us like we're not supposed to have emotions. And
Ouch.
so like we don't say it, we don't like it just kind of festers there. And same thing for women. They might be upset something you're doing the entire time and then finally it explodes. And for men in that situation, they're like, this came out of nowhere. I thought she was happy. I thought she was like everything was great. Why is she all of a sudden like unhappy about this? And I talk with one guy right now that's like that, and like it's like we look back at all these patterns, and he's like recognizing, oh, she's been kind of hinting at this all along. I just never paid attention to it because we were doing these other things, or I was focused on this other stuff.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, there's always that miscommunication, that miscalibration of what you're supposed to be doing in a relationship, and that communication is so key. Without it, like it's not easy, but you got to do it in order to continue growing together.
Both
Lucy,
of
were you
you
gonna
are.
add?
Yes, I wanted to ask because I'm hearing even you, Chris, mentioning the fear. And I'm curious, what would you say to hear from maybe both of you? What would you say helps you overcome that fear from having that conversation? What is your strategy?
Yeah, I guess if you're asking me to start,
Oh,
I'll
you
start then.
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, go first. Yeah.
So coming back to my true center, and that's really what it is, right? Because if I'm
Mhm.
being who I truly am internally in alignment with myself, because I know my true self, I think that so it comes back to this knowing the old saying, know thyself. And if you are fulfilled with thyself or happy with thyself, then whatever I communicate is going to be in alignment with that. And so if I'm in alignment with myself, that's okay. Other people, and it took me a while to figure this out because this is a challenge for men these days. Because now they have been trained and told that whatever you feel naturally, that's wrong. So, for example, for men, we have at any given time, sometimes 1,000 times more testosterone than women. Are we going to be a little bit more aggressive? Are we going to be a little bit more standoffish at times? Yeah, it's part of our DNA. It's part of our hormonal structure. So does that mean we need to be belligerent and stuff like that? No. But if we want to have a stern voice, whether it's whatever communication, sometimes with our kids or whatever that might look like, sometimes we have to express that. Because when we subdue that, that's when we feel like we're not being in alignment with ourselves. And a lot of men are being
Mm.
told that now, that that's no longer valid, right? That's not right.
Ouch.
And that does, and so when you do that enough for men, in particular, they stop communicating because now they're unsure of what to communicate. They're not confident within themselves. So I'm not saying this whole, we've had centuries and centuries, millennia of men being belligerent and all that kind of stuff. I understand that. But if we talk about the average person who's mindful, man, and he has good intentions, and now we're saying, no, you can't communicate that way, or you shouldn't say that, he's going to second guess himself and just be like, what's right, what's wrong, and lose touch with himself. So for me, this is one of the things that we do in terms of our work with men. And I'm coming back to this in terms of your question is I need to be in tune with myself. And if I'm in tune with myself, then I can communicate effectively. That's very, very important.
And it also sounds like not just being in tune with yourself, but also not shaming those parts of selves and not taking maybe other people's judgments internally.
Yeah, it's so
Kind
important.
of self-acceptance.
Yeah, self-acceptance, because I have to, with my son, raising him was really interesting. It was an experiment, and with my daughter too, right? It was almost like a social experiment. And what I realized was I do need to communicate to my son differently. Sometimes I have to have a sterner voice with my son. And at the beginning, I was just like, should I do this? Should I not do this? Whatever. And then that wasn't natural for me. And then I said, let me see being more natural to myself. And he responded better. So we have to acknowledge that, because sometimes our gut sometimes does direct us in the right way.
I love it.
I'm glad you came back to the question, because I actually forgot the question because I was listening so intently to what you were saying. That's like really reflecting on it. I think what helps me even have that conversation is, number one, I think I'm comfortable having it because of just my training and like I've done a lot of it. But I think I always reflect back, especially my personal relationship, is how important is this issue? Is this issue going to be something that's going to really continue to fester and grow? I'm going to be bothered by it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or in 5 years, will I even remember that this was an issue in my mind? And that's always helped me keep perspective, especially like those early days of when we had kids and they were infants, and it's stressful for everybody. Nobody's getting any sleep. And everybody feels like they're doing an inordinate share of work in whatever way. And then I think I would be there doing a bunch of the housework, and I would think, it's annoying. I feel like I'm doing more work, but also in 5 years, am I going to remember that I did this? Like, is it really going to matter? And then most of the time it didn't. Most of the time I was like, all right, whatever. I'm not going to remember this. But there would be times where something would come up and I'd like, you know what? I think I'm going to continue. This is going to continue gnawing at me. And so I would talk about it with her. So that's always helped me, is thinking about how important is this issue to me really? Is it just a mild annoyance, or is it something that really needs to be discussed? Pradeep, I would, let's imagine now, for whatever reason in somebody's life, they put on this podcast, and instead of listening to the podcast, they skip to the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes of this episode for whatever reason in their life, and they're coming in, hey, welcome, listen to the rest of the episode. What are 1 to 2 takeaways that you would really hope people would take away from this conversation?
Wow, yeah, that's a tough one. We had some great conversations here, and we talked for a while. The thing, I think, coming back to the question that you asked, Lucie, was, the communication part, which is, I think it's so important for an individual to be in tune with themselves. And many of us have lost that being in tune, or just lost ourselves, or we've never perhaps been even really in touch with ourselves. And that part is so important, because when we're authentic and aligned more with ourselves, then we can have more effective communication. And that fundamentally comes down to it. And I think that's important. If I share like a real life stories, when I'm in line with myself, other people around me, I don't even have to really say much. They just get me, because I'm behaving in a way that's in alignment with myself. And I like it. And hopefully those people around me in my friendships, obviously, they would probably like it because they're hanging out with me. They're my friends. So we're automatically more aligned from that perspective. So it's not always verbal communication. It's also body language and our own behavior. Do I feel like I'm acting within myself, in alignment with myself? If I'm not, then that whatever communication I put out is either going to be not authentic, or it's going to be misaligned. I think that's the first part. And coming back to something I said before, which was all forms of communication they have two aspects. One is information, the other one is energy. So we really have to be aware of what kind of energy we are transferring to other people, also absorbing from other people, but also the information that's involved. Because if we get better at communicating, we're going to get better at transferring information and better at transferring energy. And that's ultimately what good relationships are about in terms of interactions and communication. And why do we communicate? Every form of communication is a way of some kind of influence. It's sharing. Hey, even if you don't want someone to do something, it's I'm okay. We're in each other's presence. Or, for a baby, they cry because they're hungry. Even if I look over at my son while he's doing something and I kind of give him the eye, it's because I'm saying, chill out, son, or whatever it might be, my daughter. Everything is a form of influence. Every communication is some kind of form of influence. So I think if we get better at understanding it, which I think why your podcast is so great, for people to learn that is such a masterful skill that just improves quality of life and relationships and happiness and ultimately fulfillment. And we're all here, as one of my mentors, spiritual mentors, once said, every day we should be living it like we're in Disneyland, because that's what life is like. That's the whole point of life. If you're going to go to Disneyland, if you're not going to enjoy it, what's the point?
I love that analogy. That's great. Also, can we,
awesome.
I appreciate you talking about how great our podcast is. Can we talk just a little bit about how great our podcast is?
Yeah.
No. Every guest we have says something to your point about our tagline, which is we believe like if we can communicate better, we can live better. So it brings to mind like that's a really powerful, like I didn't come up with it, Lucie came up with it. I think it's an incredible tagline because like people keep bringing it up in different ways, independently of us saying it to them. So it's so true about how we need to communicate better.
Yeah, absolutely. I 110% agree. Pretty soon my kids are going to come running through the door and it'll be interesting to see what they communicate.
So Purdeep, you have a book, you have some stuff. How can people find you? How can people follow you? How can people get your book and learn more and stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I think the simplest way is you can take a look at, I'm most active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me on there. Or my website is purdeepsangha.com. The work that we do in particular when it comes to high performance is the executive lab, so the execlab.com. And my book, it's The Complete Man. So if you like the physical copy, you can go to completemanbook.com. Or if you want the audio and the ebook, you can go to completemanaudio.com. And there's a promo code that I can give, which is limited, or this one is different actually, Victory 75. So the word victory and then 75, you get 75% off the digital audio and ebook.
We'll put all those links in the chat so people can get to it. But Purdeep, I love this conversation.
Me too.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome questions. You guys are very mindful. Actually, this is one of the best, my funnest podcasts that I've had.
Oh,
thank you.
nice.
This is
Thank
sweet.
you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully we'll get to have you back. I think we've had so many guests who have been focused on men's issues and communication and health. It makes me wonder if we should have like a panel of people like talking about that, and then have a panel about women's health. And
that would be fun.
That would be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we have that, would you be willing to come back?
Absolutely. Sounds like a party to me.
Yay.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Purdeep Sangha for joining us, for sharing his wisdom. It was an enlightening conversation for me. I always think it's interesting thinking about how to combine both of our domains, our work, our personal life, and all of our stuff together, because even though we like to compartmentalize our work life and our personal life, really we're the same person in all those things, and we kind of have to put our little face in different places, but we're still the same person. We still have the same mind, and so it's important to think about how we working together around that. So again, big thanks. If you want to follow him, we'll put all those notes in the chat, in the show notes below. Please give us a like, please give us a comment, subscribe, let us know what you think. Do you agree? Do you think that there needs to be more communication to improve this interplay between our physical health and our professional health and our well-being? And how do you do that? Is that something that's easy for you or difficult? So let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we will see you next week. Thanks a lot.